Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Part 3, Climate Plus Baseline and Strategy for Leather. Today's presentation will be recorded and posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Now on to Nicole with Textile Exchange. Nicole?
Thank you, Rose, and welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Leather Roundtable. As Rose was saying, this is our third webinar on the series of evaluating and monitoring challenges at the farm level of the bovine leather supply chain. And today we will be focusing on our Climate Plus baseline and strategy for leather. So just some very quick housekeeping that was actually already mentioned by Rose, but just to remind you that this event is recorded and will be shared with you later on. You are all muted, but we really do welcome your participation. So please do send us your comments and feedback, as well as all your questions by using the Q&A function in the toolbar. Yes, so as mentioned, we've set up this series of webinars on evaluating and monitoring challenges at the farm level of the bovine leather supply chain. Our first webinar was focused on animal welfare, and our second one, which happened this summer, was on deforestation. So I'm not exactly very objective, but they were really good webinars with amazing speakers. So if you have not had the opportunity to participate in those webinars, I do really encourage you to listen to the recordings. They are available on the Leather Roundtable Hub, and Siobhan will be sharing the links now in the chat if ever you want to go there. Today, we will be focusing on the Climate Plus baseline and strategy for leather. And I would also like to apologize because I know there was a lot of confusion around the date that was changed a few times, and there was a bit of confusion in the communications. So thank you for all of you for joining today. After a quick intro, I will hand the floor to Eleni, who will give us a quick deep dive into, the Climate Plus approach on leather impacts and impact data. And then I'll give you an overview of our Climate Plus strategy for leather. So today we have a 100% speakers panel from Textile Exchange. My name is Nicole Lambert. I'm the leather manager at Textile Exchange, and it's my pleasure to present you to Eleni, who is the Climate Plus Impact Data Senior Manager. So definitely the right person to talk to when it comes to impact data. Before Eleni takes over, I would just like to give you a quick reminder on what the Climate Plus strategy is. I think most of you are already familiar with it. We've been talking about it over a few years now already. Basically, Textile Exchange set the very ambitious goal to help the fashion and textile industry achieve a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that come from producing fibers and raw materials, and this by 2030. So this is also known as Tier 4 of the supply chain, and it's estimated to account for about 24% of the industry's GHG emissions. We call it Climate Plus because it goes beyond just accounting for GHG emissions. We also have a more holistic approach where we take into consideration other impact areas such as soil health, biodiversity, water, but also animal welfare. The Plus also acknowledges that Textile Exchange cannot achieve this goal alone. There is no way. And that we will only be able to meet this very ambitious goal through strong partnerships. So as you can imagine, the impact of each fiber and material is different. And in the same way, our strategy to contribute to that 45% reduction in GHGs will vary for each fiber and material. So today the idea is really to give you an overview of as to how leather is being considered within the Climate Plus strategy, including how we built the baseline for leather and how we believe we can best leverage the opportunities we have with this material to contribute to our ambitious Climate Plus goals. So I will now hand it over to Lenny.
Thanks, Nicole. It's really great to be talking to everyone today. As Nicole has said, if there are any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try and answer towards the end of the session. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Nicole. Thank you. So familiar slide, we were just looking at this together, but I'm going to talk about this in relation to our impact data function at Textile Exchange. So what we're trying to do as the impact data team is track progress against our GHG emission reduction target, that 45% that Nicole very nicely described just a second ago. But in addition to that, we're looking to building out the way that we measure and monitor progress against soil health, biodiversity, water, and then also not forgetting two key impact areas of animal welfare and social well-being in the supply chain. That work, the impact data function, would describe our approach to soil health, water, biodiversity, climate as our LCA plus approach, which really means accounting for impacts that go beyond those typically included within life cycle assessment study and marries up to what we're trying to achieve from a Climate Plus perspective. There are multiple ways that you can measure each of these different impact areas. We at Textile Exchange won't be developing methodologies to do that, but we'll be drawing on best available resources and methodologies that are being developed externally. So I'll go into each of those points in a little bit more detail during the presentation. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So our impact data work streams can be split into two. The first is focused on life cycle assessments data and LCI life cycle inventory data. And the second looks at this LCA plus approach, which is really speaking to how we measure those impact areas that are not typically included within life cycle assessment studies, but are key to our Climate Plus strategy and also key to impact more broadly, so things we should be considering. We'll start by looking at our LCA plus approach, so just a bit of context and framing for you all, so you can see how these puzzle pieces, as we like to call them, fit together. So next slide, please. Thank you. So our LCA plus approach is currently in the process of being built out. We're defining our framework at the moment on how we want to account for these impact areas not typically covered within life cycle assessment studies. This means identifying the metrics and indicators that we want to consider, but also the level that we want to be measuring these things at. So if we think about our GHG reduction targets, that considers global impacts. That's across our industry. But we know that we need to be tracking impact data beyond that level as well and looking at place-based impacts. And as I mentioned, we'll be looking to external methodologies that are being developed to do that. So one to call out, one kind of area of work which is being led by the Science Based Target Network is on science-based targets for nature. So coming up with methodologies like we already have for greenhouse gas emission reporting and target setting, but for areas of biodiversity, land, freshwater, and oceans as well. So next slide, please. Thank you. So here we have a separation of what falls under an LCA remit at a broad level and what then falls into an LCA plus approach. These are specific indicators that we might want to look at. Something to note is that as we are looking to external methodologies for the approach we'll take, is that these may change over time, but this is where we're currently sitting and where we've landed for the time being. So GHGs, water indicators, land use, often captured within life cycle assessment studies. LCA plus indicators speak more to biodiversity, soil health, social well-being and welfare, and animal welfare in the supply chain. And like I said, there are many ways that you can measure, particularly these LCA plus indicators, but we need to find an approach that works at this global level, but also for place-based impacts. Next slide, please. Thanks, Nicole. So building on that, the previous slide is really like describes what we want to be measuring, and then I would say this is describing how we want to be doing that. And at the moment, this is mainly theoretical, and it's likely that this will be iterated over time. So just something to bear in mind for the time being. So our first approach is what we call our landscape level approach. So this is looking at global impacts. So the GHG emission reduction targets and tracking that I'll go into a little bit more detail on in a moment would fall under this landscape level approach. It uses LCA data from recognized LCA databases to estimate global GHG impacts. It'd be great if we could do something similar for biodiversity, water indicators, soil health as well. And we need to really to track where we are as an industry. The next layer down under this landscape level approach is what we call ground truthing. I often refer to this as place-based impacts. So this is how we leverage geospatial data, specific metrics for on-the-ground measurements to evidence what we're seeing at a global level, and to have case studies for the direction of travel that's happening across our fibre and material types. And then the final level there speaks to satellite monitoring. So we're building out that strategy over the coming months. But how does that fit into our more regular impact measurements, if you'd like to call it that? Given that LCA data represents one point in time, a specific supply chain, but we need to be measuring things on a more regular basis and tracking progress on a more regular basis. And then the second approach, call it our corporate level approach. This really speaks to our corporate fibre material benchmark and all the work that our CFMB team are doing. So measuring and tracking what the industry is using from a methodology perspective, whether it's GHGs or impact areas that fall under the SBTN, Science-Based Target Network's remit. The idea of having these two approaches is that we're able to connect them by looking to these external methodologies. It's unlikely that we could tally up corporate level impacts and get to our global level impacts, but we should be speaking the same language, and it should be almost like a case study approach for tracking. So we need to ensure that there's consistency. And then the idea would be to have other targets across our Climate Plus impact areas like we have for GHG, our GHG emission reduction. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to move on now to talk about our LCA, LCI, life cycle assessment, life cycle inventory work. And then I'll talk about our GHG emission reporting and where we're currently at with that. So next slide, thank you. So we've been working on an LCA gap analysis to understand what data gaps exist for our industry across all fibre and material types. This is really taking into consideration Tier 4 impacts, I should say. During this process, we identified a number of priorities, many priorities, as I'm sure you can imagine. So the first set of priorities speaks to animal fibres. So here we're currently in the scoping phase for a cashmere LCA, a responsible wool standards LCA, and a responsible mohair standard LCA. And super exciting that we're currently trying to build these out, and the scoping phase will inform the exact approach that will be taken during the detailed LCA studies. Then we've identified priorities beyond animal fibres, and work hasn't kicked off on these materials yet. The idea would be to start in 2023. So for plant fibres, we have cotton, and this would really be looking at refreshing the organic and conventional cotton data that exists. For synthetics, We would like to explore polyester impacts in a little bit more detail and refresh some of the data that's being used there. So this would be conventional or virgin polyester, and then recycled polyester, which would consider the various recycled options and technologies that exist. Potentially nylon, although this is likely to be a secondary priority to polyester. And then leather under other animal materials. And I'll talk a little bit more about the leather LCA in a moment. And then stitching all of these things together and kind of underpinning that work is access to some of the background data, inventory data. So in parallel, we'll be supporting or building out an LCI library to give our industry access to the underlying input-output data that's being used across life cycle assessment studies. A couple of things to note. So all these studies will explore appropriate methodologies for building out impacts for different production systems that exist. I called out here nomadic herding, which is something that exists for cashmere, but also across other animal-based materials. We'll also look into allocation approaches, and we're really keen to conduct some sensitivity analysis depending on the allocation approach used in the final results. And then really importantly, in speaking to our LCA Plus work and our Climate Plus strategy, we want to start integrating some kind of measurements for our LCA Plus impact areas. So biodiversity, soil health, water, social well-being, and animal welfare. We're not sure at the moment whether these assessments for our LCA Plus impact areas will be qualitative or quantitative, though we're really keen to take a first step and start building out what that could look like in the future. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll move on to the GHG impact results. I'm going to start fairly broad and take you through the overall results updates that we've made to our 2019 baseline, and then we'll dive into leather in a bit more detail. So next slide, please. Thank you. And before I actually talk about this, we did have a GHG impact session, a webinar. I think it was towards the end of July now, which is available on the Hub. It was recorded and the slides are available. So there's a bit more detail in there if you wanted to look back and learn a bit more about our approach. So when we're doing our GHG impact modelling, we use two data sources, well, multiple data sources, but two consolidated data sources. The first is our preferred fibre material market reports. So this contains market data across fibre and material types, production per year, broken down by preferred options and virgin options and conventional options. And then we use GHG midpoints. So these are global average GHG emission factors. Typically, these are GHG impact per kilogram of fibre or material. The calculation is fairly straightforward, where we multiply these things together. In some cases, we have to apply like scaling factors to ensure the functional units align. So we're talking about apples and apples rather than apples and apple juice, for example. And then when we don't have impact data, we often have to model some materials off an equivalent material. When we do this, we typically take like the worst case scenario for an equivalent material to ensure that we're being conservative in our estimates. And the granularity of the results available is very much dependent on the breakdown of the production data and what's available from an impact data perspective. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here are some differences between our previous and updated baseline. So our previous baseline was developed in 2019-2020, and the updated baseline was developed this year. Some key differences between the two. The previous baseline was looking at global production across all sectors. Our updated baseline looks at this, but also applies sector-specific allocation percentages to the results. So that means that we're able to isolate the impacts of our sector, apparel and textiles, which is really exciting. It's the first time we've been able to do that. Materials included, so we extended the scope of the materials we include in our baseline based on production data availability and also impact data availability. So we now include alpaca, rubber, which is natural and synthetic rubber, all other plant fibers, so things like manila and core, and then other synthetics as well. And then materials excluded for the updated baseline. There are just some animal fibers that are currently not included because there isn't any impact data available. And then data sources for our previous versus updated baseline. Previously, we did some gap filling using our corporate fiber material benchmark. For the updated baseline, we're just using the preferred fiber material market report. And then for the impact data, so a couple of updates. One related to leather. So here the leather impact data has been updated to account for wastage rates across the supply chain. And we've been able to isolate just the tier 4 impacts as well. So up to fresh hide production, which is the same unit that we're collecting production data for globally. Some of our plant fiber impacts are proxied, as I mentioned. And then we've also proxied recycled polypropylene and recycled acrylic off their conventional or virgin options. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is our previous baseline that I said was calculated back in 2019-2020 of 611 million tons of CO2e. This was driven by polyester and leather, followed by cotton, man-made cellulosics, and then other fibers and materials. So this is just a quick recap. If we move on to the next slide, you'll be able to see how this baseline has been updated. So this is still at a global production level. This is not the impacts just relevant for textiles and apparel at the moment. And these impacts just represent tier 4 of the supply chain. So they're just the key things to bear in mind when we're looking at these results. So with the updated baseline, we move from 611 million tons to 495 million tons of CO2e, with some additional materials included. And we see changes in what's driving the overall results. So polyester remains significant, accounting still for around about a third of global impacts. This is then followed by rubber, man-made cellulosics, and then leather becomes equivalent to nylon, and not far off what we see for cotton and wool. So if we go to the next slide. So now we'll look at the baseline impacts by sector, so isolating just textiles and apparel, and what this means for our 45% emission reduction targets. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our 45% emission reduction target here, we've got two sets of column charts. The first is looking at what that 45% reduction looks like at a global level when we're not isolating just the impacts of textiles and apparel. So it'd be going from 495 million tons of CO2e to 270 million tons of CO2e. When we isolate just apparel, textiles, footwear, we have 300 million tons of CO2e as our actual 2019 baseline. So this means from a target perspective, we should be working towards around 160 to 170 million tons of CO2e by 2030. Now, we've included a range there because there's some uncertainty in the data we're using. Impact data, production data, and the sector split data all get refreshed year on year. And so we just have to have a bit of tolerance there, but the direction of travel remains the same. Now, when we calculated our first progress year results for 2020, we saw a slight decrease from 300 million tons to 292 million tons of CO2e. This slight decrease was just as a result of the pandemic and changes to production because of that. The 2021 PFMR data is going to be released shortly. Initial initial findings from that show we're going back to an increasing impacts for 2021, but once we've released the PFMR data, we'll be able to restate we'll just be able to calculate our 2021 impacts and share those with you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned our 2022 progress of 292 million tonnes of CO2e. Here we've just plotted the results against a business as usual scenario, which assumes a 3% growth rate year on year, and our 45% reduction trajectory, so what we're aiming for between 2019 and 2030. Next slide, please. Thank you. I thought it might be useful to show you how the splits across fibre and material categories varies between our global impacts for the 2019 baseline and just looking at apparel, home textiles and footwear. So polyester remains a key driver, but we see cotton slightly increase its impact share along with man-made cellulosics, and leather increases ever so slightly, but rubber and nylon actually decrease, which is just interesting and something to be aware of. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now looking into the leather impact results, here we've put global production of each of the leather types that we collect data for. So this is goat, sheep leather, cattle leather, and buffalo, and then married up against the share of impact across these leather types. So there aren't any kind of disproportionate production versus impact data points. They're fairly aligned. Cattle leather makes up the majority of the impact. The 2020 results are fairly consistent with the 2019 baseline, hence why we're just showing these results. There are no significant differences across the two. 70% of the global GHG impact for leather can be attributed to our sectors, apparel, home textiles and footwear. Just to flag, this sector split data is currently being reviewed and so is subject to change. And then the majority of impact across our sectors is driven by footwear, approximately 70%. And the overall GHG impact is 44 million tonnes of CO2e. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to go through some of the assumptions surrounding this leather impact data, just so we're all clear on what it does and doesn't do. So the impact data that we're using and the calculations for GHG impacts that we're conducting consider tier 4 impacts only. So this is fresh hide production. None of the transformation processes are included in our impact results. Production data is available for cattle, buffalo, sheep, and goat leather. And this is actually for fresh hide production, but we just call it leather. Impact data is available for cattle and goat leather only. So buffalo leather is modelled off cattle and sheep is modelled off goats. So two really key assumptions there. And this is just based on what's available from an impact data perspective and our need to try and include as much as possible within the calculations. The data set for cattle leather is a global average that considers a 50-50 split between US and Brazilian production only. And the data is modelled in a way that means that feedlot and pasture-raised cattle systems are represented in these impacts. And then the underlying LCA study for goat leather is based off pig farming, which means that goat and sheep leather are modelled off a pig production system. This is very much due to the lack of data available for goats and sheep hide production. And as more data becomes available, it's possible that these impacts could change significantly. So this is an area of uncertainty at the moment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to talk about how we want to improve some of those assumptions that are currently being made, like our focus work streams related to leather from an impact data perspective. So And we're currently developing out an RFP, request for proposal, scope of work, for a leather LCA study. This should hopefully be one of our priorities for 2023, and we're just in the very early stages of pulling this together. This will initially focus on cattle and calf leather production, and then dependent on resources available, we'll hopefully look into sheep and goat production. And we will consider the different rearing systems in operation globally. So it won't be that we're just representing one kind of production system. And this will be done at a varying geographic level, which is still to be determined and depends on the scoping phase of the LCA studies that we'll hopefully be commissioning. The methods being employed within the LCA studies will align with the land sector and removals guidance for GHG accounting. So this is super important when we're thinking about a material like leather, where we need to account for land use changes, and then how that relates not just to land area but also to GHG emissions. And then in addition to all of this, we'd really like the studies to consider our LCA plus impact areas. So biodiversity, I've called out deforestation here, given the importance to the leather supply chain, soil health, animal welfare, and social welfare. So these aren't currently considered in life cycle assessment studies. And then in addition to this, we want to look at how we can take a place-based impact approach for monitoring these impact areas going forwards. So that goes beyond the LCA study remits, but something that we're looking at with our broader impact data framework. So we're really interested in hearing any thoughts from this group on these ideas and any scope considerations for the potential studies as well. And I believe that's my last slide. Yes, so thank you so much for your time. Look forward to answering the questions when we get to the end of the session.
Thank you so much, Lenny. That was great. And there's definitely a bunch of questions that are accumulating in the Q&A chat here. So we'll take all the questions at the end. So I will be giving you an overview of our key priorities within the Climate Plus strategy for leather. As you can imagine, there is a lot that can be done in this space, but we needed to prioritize in terms of where we could have the biggest impact. A reminder, the Climate Plus goal is set for 2030. That's 7 years from now. And then we also needed to prioritize in terms of, what can Textile Exchange, what are we in a position to support the industry and drive the changes that are needed through the expertise and the experience that we have. So if we start with the scope of what we're considering in our priorities, as Eleni mentioned also in the approach earlier, we're looking into the pre-spinning phases of the textile fiber and materials production. So what that means for leather is really the farming and the slaughter levels of the supply chain. In terms of species, when we look at rawhide production in 2020, 68%, so almost 70% of all leather was from cattle. So that is also going to be our key focus area. Now we'll look into the priority impact areas we have chosen for the leather strategy, and which I think will come as no surprise to anyone, really. For those of you that were able to participate in our last webinar on deforestation, you'll recognize the slides that follow that were presented by the World Resource Institute. So here on this one, we look at tropical primary forest loss over the past 20 years. Unfortunately, despite the awareness around the importance of deforestation and the need to stop it, we can only just see that there hasn't been a reduction over the past 20 years, and there's even been an increase. When we look into the drivers of tree cover loss around the world, there's quite a clear pattern that we can distinguish. When we're looking at the northern hemisphere here, the main causes of deforestation are really related to forestry, and unfortunately also wildfires that are becoming more and more, predominant. But then if we look at the southern hemisphere, with the exception of Oceania, of course, we can see there that the picture is quite different. Deforestation is in this part of the world is really driven by agriculture, and that is labeled here in this graph as a shifting agriculture and commodity-driven deforestation. And so, as you can see in Latin America, agriculture is the driver of 91% of tree cover loss. Now, what are the commodities that are driving this land use change is the next question. And the World Resource Institute published a study in 2018 where they demonstrated that the production of 7 commodities, being cattle, oil palm, soy, cocoa, rubber, coffee, and wood fiber, were responsible for 57% of tree cover loss from agriculture, and cattle alone explains 36%. So in this graph, cattle production, linked to deforestation is indicated in the dark blue here. And as you can see, there does not seem to be a significant decrease between 2001 and 2015 in the amount of forest area replaced by pasture for cattle production. So I'll go on to my last doom and gloom slide I promised for today, but I think it is very important to know where we are at today and what we have to deal with and the emergency of the response that is needed. As you all know, forests act both as a carbon sink and a carbon source. If we look at the net carbon flux in the 3 major rainforests in the world, the status is unfortunately not what we would like to see. So starting from the right here, the rainforest in Southeast Asia has already become a net carbon source. So it's emitting more carbon than it is able to absorb. In the Amazon River basin, the ratio between emissions and absorption is reducing year on year. And as per 2021, as indicated in this graph, it was still able to act as a sink, but we do know that there are certain regions already in the Amazon River basin that are net carbon sources. So that leaves us and the planet with the Congo River basin as the only major rainforest that still has enough standing forest to remain a strong net carbon sink. So it will come as no surprise to you that deforestation is our #1 impact area we want to focus on with regards to our Climate Plus leather strategy. And to be very specific, we will be focusing our efforts on deforestation in South America, where we know cattle production is a primary driver of deforestation. So from an LCA plus perspective, this is how we see the impacts or the impact potential, I would say, of tackling this challenge. We have the GHG emissions. I found this quote the other day, which I thought was really interesting. Being able to estimate exactly, the amount of emissions cuts that could happen through the protection and restoration of forests, I think is quite complicated. But here, the estimation is 18% of the emission cuts needed by 2030 to prevent catastrophic climate change. And so that is big. There's an opportunity to act on biodiversity. Tropical forests house over half of the Earth's biodiversity. And finally, and not least, and there is more than just these 3 points, but people. As much as 80% of the world's remaining forests, biodiversity lies within indigenous peoples' territories. And the forest today provides for the livelihoods of millions of people. So we see this as a great opportunity to use the market power of brands and retailers to push for deforestation to be addressed in the bovine leather supply chain and make those systemic changes that are really needed to solve for deforestation linked to cattle production. Another key impact area we want to focus on in the bovine leather supply chain is animal welfare. So Textile Exchange has an expertise in addressing animal welfare at the farm level, and we want to leverage that, and we believe the industry could really benefit from it. So far, what we've done is, as a part of the Leather Impact Accelerator, we've developed an animal welfare standard benchmark. So it's not a standard. It's a framework that defines what a standard needs to address to identify the minimum level of animal care that would be expected from a cattle producer. So we've even gone a little further, and we've identified 3 additional levels that allows us to distinguish standards that go beyond that minimal level of animal welfare, which is our baseline, and that progresses towards the highest levels of animal welfare. The last level allowing us to distinguish standards that recognize only fully grass-based systems. So today, there are already several animal welfare standards out there, and that can be applied to the cattle production. So we don't really see the point right now in developing, a standard and duplicating efforts. But we do understand that from a brand's perspective, it can become really complicated when you're presented with several standards, and having to assess each standard and assess what they're actually addressing, if it's enough or not, if the standard is actually robust. So through the LEA standard benchmark, we're aiming to do that job for you. So you will know that an animal welfare standard that meets our benchmark will address as a minimum the minimum level of animal welfare we have identified, and you have access to that in the benchmark, which is available publicly. So just to recap quickly, the priorities of our Climate Plus leather strategy will be to address the farming and slaughter levels of the bovine leather supply chain, and our key focus will be deforestation in South America and animal welfare. So as I said, these are our priorities, and so this is where we will be investing most of our time and efforts, but that does not exclude that between now and 2030, we may also address other challenges, so I'm putting that out there as well. Our vision with regards to leather and Climate Plus is brands that source leather which is deforestation free and delivers beneficial Climate Plus and animal welfare outcomes. On the short term, we want to see brands that use leather commit publicly to achieve deforestation-free leather sourcing by 2030 or earlier. So we know that is no little ask, and we are also very aware that not all the solutions are in place at the scale needed today to reach that deforestation-free sourcing in all parts of the world. But the signals that are needed to be sent to the supply chain already, and we need to all be working together and contributing to developing those solutions and scaling their adoption. And this can't wait 2030. By 2025, 2027 at the latest, what we're hoping for is that brands will know where they are sourcing from. So they'll be able to identify where their slaughterhouses are located, and hence assess if they are sourcing from high or low risk regions. But we can't wait until then to start acting on deforestation. You've seen the statistics. Deforestation is happening, and we need to address this now. And the cattle producers cannot be the only ones to carry that burden. So they need to be supported. And so between now and 2025, 2027, we will be encouraging brands and retailers to financially invest in deforestation-free cattle farming in high-risk regions, even if it's outside of their own supply shed. We've developed the impact incentives, which is one tool that could be used to achieve this. So for this short term, which will become a long-term goal, we are aiming to provide you with a roadmap and a toolkit to help brands and retailers achieve this ambitious commitment. So in the long term, what we're hoping to see is, sorry, up, there you go. In the long term, what we're hoping to see, so by 2030, is that all major leather brands in the apparel, footwear, and I should actually add on home textile industry, are using leather that is either verified low risk or certified verified deforestation free and animal welfare. So we have a lot to do, and the ambition is very high, but we really believe there is an opportunity to contribute to major change that this planet needs, and that together we can do this. So I'll end there. And now we'll be able to open for questions. So Lenny, I'll let you unmute yourself as well. And we can go through the questions because there's quite a few.
Yeah, I have been sending some responses, typed responses, but happy to go through any.
Is there a question that you would like to answer first? I think maybe the first one is interesting because I know that is a big topic. It's the allocation factor used. Do you want to maybe answer that?
Yes, so I was just double checking that. I think the allocation factor that's currently being applied for cattle leather is 3.6%. But that's embedded into the LCA data that we're using.
If we are considering fresh hide production, how is it being assessed that 70% of the impact is due to apparel and footwear when the hide represents very little portion of the animal itself?
So the 70% is after the impact of the animal is apportioned to the hide only. So the step would be the allocation of impact to the fresh hide being produced, and then we would apply 70%. Then we apply our emission factors, calculate the impact by sector, and then that comes out as 70% is related to apparel and footwear.
Then we have a question here about, have you been able to capture, whether all this leather is a byproduct of the food industry or if the cattle has been reared just for leather? So it's very clear that for cattle leather or bovine leather, it is a byproduct of the food industry. And today, farmers are receiving little to nothing for the hides of their animals is the current situation. For scope, suggestion is to do from birth farm to slaughter. Oh, so this is more for the LCA, slaughter wet white or wet blue stage, as are many organizations like LWG doing LCAs in tannery levels. And actually, just to add on to that, LWG isn't doing an amazing work right now on developing LCA related to leather production, and it goes from the beginning of the processing, so it's beam house all the way to finished leather. So I think, if we would focus on anything, it would be up to slaughter, or like slaughter door. Gate, that was a gate, not door. Oh, sorry, someone asked about a study, if it was public around deforestation in cattle. I can definitely send you some links. There are a lot of studies around deforestation in cattle, but yeah, this one, the World Resource Institute study that was published in 2018 is a really good one, but there are more recent ones as well. So a question around regenerative leather being potentially considered in our scope of studies. So I'm wondering if that's for the LCA.
Yeah, I think it is. Not at the moment in the scope of works that we've been building out. The focus has been on conventional systems and modeling out.
Can you try speaking again?
Oh, me?
There, yeah, you're back. Can you just
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I was saying not at the moment for regenerative leather being included in the initial scope of work that we've drafted. The focus will be on the different production systems that exist, conventional systems, but that could be a next step to a project.
Mm-hmm. And then I have a question here about the animal welfare standard benchmark, if it's intended for leather only, or if we see it expanding to other certifications they're saying right now. But the animal welfare standard benchmark that we've designed is really for cattle production. So it takes into consideration, the challenges and the considerations that are specific to cattle. So that's very different from what you would find for sheep production or goat production, for instance. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. Oh, is there any label that certifies the origin of the cattle to make sure it didn't contribute to deforestation? So today that doesn't exist. We would love for it to exist, but the complexities, and we'll have the opportunity to get more into the details of that, I think, through the next year. And actually at our Leather Roundtable Summit, we'll be talking about the issues around traceability throughout the bovine leather supply chain. But unfortunately today there are no labels. So what a brand needs to do is identify where they're sourcing from in terms of, where the slaughterhouses are located. So that's the first step, which will give you an idea if you are in a high or low risk country to start off with. I mean, if you're sourcing from the Netherlands, deforestation is not an issue. If you're sourcing from Brazil, the risks are higher. And then what you need to do for the due diligence, each country also delivers a different level of traceability. And in some parts of the world, it's very clearly designed and systematic, which allows you to be able to connect the dots. In other parts of the world, that is more challenging. But yeah. Oh, how can I as a brand monitor animal welfare standards when sourcing leather? Good question. Again, I think the only way you can do that currently is identifying your slaughterhouses and then asking them. But right now, I mean, what we're seeing, we work a lot in Brazil, for instance, is, as I was saying earlier, that the farmers are not getting paid for the hides of their animals is basically the thing. So if they are certified to an animal welfare certification, the interest there for them is really related to the premium they might get at slaughter for meat. So in some countries there is an adoption for that, there's a demand for that, so you'd be able to identify that at slaughter. In other countries there's just not a demand for meat that comes from animal welfare certified facilities, basically. But yeah, so that's a difficult one for sure, but it can be done as well. What type of certification available to prove that it is deforestation free? Yeah, sorry, none. Do we know how much cattle production is driven primarily by food versus textile? As I said, it's driven by food and not by leather. Veal production is slightly different because producers do get a higher income from the hides, even though it's still minor compared to the meat, the value of the meat, but it is driven by the meat industry. Oh, good question. About from deforestation, are you also considering conversion altogether as DCF-free leather by 2030, as LWG has committed for the two? Or are we going to include that in the near future? So yeah, when we do talk about deforestation, we actually do include conversion in there. Today, it's just a bit more complicated to the methodologies for conversion and monitoring that is a bit more complicated than deforestation right now when it comes to cattle, but that's definitely our intention, and we want to go towards deforestation and conversion free. We're also working very closely with the LWG and aligning a lot, both organizations on the ways we're going forward and the strategies we're having moving towards 2030. And hopefully we'll have much more to share at the conference about that. Oh, so this is for you, Lenny. Does this mean that the previous footprint for leather included processing of the fresh hides? What explains the difference and the update in wastage rates?
Yeah, so previously we weren't able to isolate just the tier 4 impacts. It was an impact per kilogram of finished leather, which is, because of wastage rates in the supply chain, significantly larger from a GHG perspective than if you were to just look at the tier 4 impacts. So that is the difference that we're seeing when we're restating our baseline. We're moving away from this aggregated data that was available at the time. There wasn't any other data for us to be using, to being able to drill down to just those tier 4 impacts. So it represents an improvement in the data that we've been using. And just to build on that, because a couple of the other questions that I answered, my answers were typed out to people who'd asked a similar question around the wastage rates and what was driving that difference. Impact data and production data and the sector split data is all dynamic. Production data, for example, historic production data gets restated year on year as industry bodies are able to collect better information, more up-to-date information. So we're not working with static data points here. We're working with a moving targets almost. So just something to bear in mind when we're talking about these GHG impact results.
Great. And then the final question, which is a difficult one, is there confirmed data on distance of slaughterhouses to finishing farms and going from finishing farm back to birthing farms? And is there a different situation depending on bovine and ovine? Oh, and I see that Anne has actually answered that question, so I might just go and read Anne's feedback on that. So we have information from NWF that the majority of farms, indirect and direct, so that's so the direct is what has been qualified as the finishing, the indirect are backgrounder and birthing farms, are within a 250-kilometer radius of slaughterhouses in Brazil. And we don't have information on other regions of the world. So yeah, I think for those of you that are involved with LWG, you're probably familiar as well with the risk map that LWG is currently designing with NWF and the University of Wisconsin, and that I think will be published very shortly, and looks very exciting. But they have taken that approach of a 250-kilometer radius around the slaughterhouses in Brazil. But yeah, it's not exact for sure, but I think in terms of probability and likelihoods, it probably captures the majority of the farms that are used to source. Last question, and we're at the top of the hour. You mentioned that farms don't receive money for the hide. Our ranch is paid per head of cattle, are actually paid separately for beef, leather, gelatine, etc. In most cases, they're paid by carcass weight, or the actual weight of the animal. So that will include the hide in it to a certain extent, but the price is really, really small. And it's really the meat that counts there. And I think it varies a little bit from one country to the next on how that's done, that slaughter. So yeah, thank you, everyone. We'll finish the questions there, and we'll make sure the questions are also communicated in this recording. Just a quick reminder before we close, I mentioned this, we have the Textile Exchange annual conference in November between the 14th and the 18th. It will be in Colorado Springs in the US, but you can also attend virtually. I would encourage all of you to register now. We have the summit on the 14th, and I think Siobhan will just put the link to the registration in the chat. Thank you to everyone for your participation. Eleni, thanks for being great as usual. So we'll end there. And yeah, if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If you don't have a login for the Leather Roundtable Hub, please also reach out to us and we'll set you up there. So thank you.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. As a friendly reminder, this presentation and recording will be posted on the Hub. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.